recording, and then I'll also start streaming, which is going to involve me pressing a button. And then I'm just going to wait. This loads. Okay, I think we are ready to go. Welcome everyone to the third colloquium of our series. I am Charles Chang. I am the chair of the Colloquium Committee, and along with Jenya Lukin and Megan Brown and the Emerging Scholars Organizing Committee, Danny Erker and Kate Lindsay, we are delighted to welcome you all to our third talk in this series. And we're super excited to have Nandi Sims here as our speaker, and I will turn it over to Professor Erker to introduce her.
Terrific. It is a genuine pleasure to welcome Nandi Sims as our colloquium speaker today. Nandi is a sociolinguist whose research focuses on language variation and change in settings of contact between people of different ethnicities and language backgrounds. Nandi's interests and expertise are really rather broad, ranging from studies of phonological variation in contemporary Miami English to diachronic morphosyntactic variation in African American English, which I got to hear about today in a one-on-one, very fun conversation with Nandi. The through line between this work and other work of Nandi's is what I would call a careful attention to how language users leverage variable linguistic features to make meaningful social moves, especially as they relate to identity. Nandi holds a BA in environmental geography as well as an MA in education from William and Mary, an MA in linguistics from Florida International, and is currently finishing up their doctoral dissertation in the Department of Linguistics at Ohio State University, The Ohio State University. The dissertation project, which won highly competitive funding from the NSF, explores language at the intersection of identity and ideology, with emphasis on preteens and how preteens negotiate their identities and those of others in a primarily Black South Florida middle school. So Nandi's work reminds us, if I can steal a line from anthropologist Ben Bailey, that to speak is to position oneself in the social world. We're very fortunate to have Nandi with us this afternoon, so please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
I'm just gonna share my screen. Give me a second. If I can figure out how to do it. This is gonna be the embarrassing time when I have no clue how to share my screen. Awesome, cool. So after that embarrassing delay, thank you so much, Dr. Erker, for the nice introduction. I'm going to just move on directly into the presentation. So South Florida is a region of Florida that's comprised of Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. It's known around the world as a hub for Caribbean commerce and culture, and that sets it apart from normative US metropolises. The Cuban enclave is the most numerous, but there's a long list of other immigrants, migrant workers, and refugees from other Caribbean and South American countries. This, in addition to transplants from around the US and the people who can trace their ancestry back to the earliest South Floridians who came themselves from Northern Florida and Georgia, makes Miami a very interesting place to study, particularly language variation and language contact. A large amount of sociological work has been conducted on Hispanic immigrants, Haitian refugees, and then the comparisons of those two groups in particular with other ethnic groups. there hasn't been much research concentrating on ethnic relations in day-to-day interactions, and also not much research concerning the African American community. So my previous research, this is from one of my qualifying papers, is with African and Haitian Americans. It showed that there are tensions between phenotypically Black ethnic groups. The tensions have been observed in previous research and in newspapers and such since the 1980s. Though it's not theorized on extensively in the South Florida context. Negative attitudes towards Haitians, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, as well as negative attitudes towards African Americans that persist throughout US culture, have both fueled mutual mistrust and a dislike of the other group that began for my participants in that past study, primarily during middle school. The tensions led to a social system of ethnic segregation in communities like Little Haiti, which is a primarily Black neighborhood, and I'll talk more specifically about it later. Haitian Americans hang out with Haitian Americans. African Americans hang out with African Americans. Both groups will have friends of other ethnicities, other Black ethnicities like Bahamian, American, and Jamaican. But those non-Haitian, non-African American individuals usually have to pick a side, and they themselves only have close friendships with either African Americans or Haitian Americans. And this is among adults who are currently around the age of 30 and probably through 50. So because the ethnic tensions that I mentioned on the last slide began in middle school, it seems as if the related structures like ethnic and social group segregation and the associated linguistic variation might begin in those years as well, despite the fact that most research points to ethnic and social identities not being fully integrated into social identity until later in adolescence. This observation led to my dissertation project, and that can be summed up in these 3 questions. So first, how do the sociocultural structures of race and ethnicity play out in the social groupings at MIMS, which is the pseudonym for the middle school I'm at? Secondly, in what ways do linguistic features vary individually and based on those social structures? And then finally, as these pre-adolescents learn and create their own places within the overarching social group structures, how do they actually change their linguistic features to fit in with their new identities? In this talk, I am concentrating on a pretty small subset of what I look at in the dissertation. I describe some of the speech features of, I describe some of the speech features of the community. I present my social structure that I came up with for MIMS and compare it to the social structures of past research. I then discuss the linguistic variation as it relates to the social structures. And then in the discussion, I attempt to consider the implications of these findings to social and sociolinguistic theory. I divided my presentation into 6 parts. First, I'll explain some of the historical social context that's important to understanding the interactions within the middle school and the surrounding communities. Then I will describe the methods I use to collect this data. Next, I present the 3 important results related to the aims that I mentioned on the last slide. I describe a number of morphological and morphosyntactic features of this community, present a model of the social stratification, and talk about how these features vary in the community. Finally, I synthesized the data to relate my research findings to other studies of adolescent social and linguistic variation. So let's move on into the first section. The historical context of South Florida is incredibly important to the social structure of the community, of the middle school community and the neighborhood in which the middle school is in. So since the region's inception in the mid-1800s, it's been characterized by migration, both from the southern US and from the Caribbean, which has resulted in a melting pot, or what some researchers have called a boiling pot, of linguistic and sociocultural practices. So Miami has relatively quickly changed from a city that was characterized by a Black-white dichotomy that's similar to that of the southern US to a city that's primarily Hispanic. In this talk, I use the term Hispanic, not only because it's the term used by the students in my school, but in order to differentiate those of Spanish-speaking backgrounds to those of other groups often included when using terms like Latinx, which could include Portuguese-speaking students or students from the Caribbean at large. So Cubans are the most populous Hispanic ethnicity and arguably the most important to the social structure of Miami at large. Cubans in Miami have had a level of power that's not usually achieved by first-generation immigrants. The Cuban influx changed the demographic structure of the region and completely reshaped the economy. The success of the Cuban population in establishing Spanish language industries has helped to pave the way for other Spanish-speaking groups like Nicaraguans and Venezuelans. As well, the upward mobility of the Cuban enclave has changed Miami into what some call the northern capital of Latin America. Given their high levels of power, white Cubans arguably hold the hegemonic center of power in Miami, which in turn has implications for the region's cultural and linguistic expectations. While the Cuban enclave in the region is the largest and most economically successful, the Cuban population is nearly entirely absent from the community that I explored in this dissertation. It's just important to talk about them in the greater Miami context. Let's see. So while they are relatively small in number, the African-American community has shaped South Florida since Dade County was founded in the mid-1800s. The first African-Americans migrated from Northern Florida and Georgia in waves in the Reconstruction era and as forced laborers through convict and debtors leases. Later migration from the Bahamas into the region called Coconut Grove, and Jamaicans and Afro-Cubans into the already established Black communities ensured an ethnically diverse set of Black Miamians. Whoops. For example, in 1930, about 28% of the Black population was foreign-born. Racial segregation made Overtown, which is the neighborhood here in the middle, the city center of Black commerce and nightlife, especially in the 1940s, with the Bahamians coming from the South in Coconut Grove, African Americans coming from the North in what was once called Lemon City and Liberty City. And then the ethnic mixing of this era has sort of ensured that many contemporary African Americans who trace their roots to this region have mixed ethnic backgrounds. A lot of my students will say, oh, I'm African American, my grandma's Bahamian, things like that. Finally, in terms of important ethnicities, are the Haitian Americans. Haitian immigration to the United States, and Miami in particular, started around the same time as the Cuban influx in the late 1950s. And this has also occurred in waves, primarily due to political unrest and natural disasters. There were middle-class Haitians who came to South Florida from sort of via Canada or New York, and they preferred not to live in predominantly Black neighborhoods. They instead moved into middle-class mixed-race neighborhoods. As well, they were light enough in skin color to pass for other ethnicities and often didn't claim or promote their Haitian ancestry. Most of the poor Haitians at the time were forced to move into the neighborhoods that are called Edison, Little River, and Little Haiti, which we'll sort of talk about on the next slide, which put them into direct contact with African Americans. Some research has shown that Haitian Americans assimilate towards African American cultural practices, but other research shows that they maintain separate Haitian identities, which is what I find in my qualifying paper. But they're also kept separate socially by religion and having separate cultural practices, separate cultural gatherings. In order to talk about the mixing of African Americans and Haitian Americans, we have to understand race segregation as it occurs in South Florida. So most neighborhoods are highly segregated along class and racial lines, as well as ethnic lines. Some neighborhoods are populated by more than 80% of one ethnicity. Historically, Black neighborhoods are nearly entirely Black and have remained so even with the immigration from the Caribbean. Working class and poor Black immigrants, like those from Haiti and Afro-Cubans, move into historically Black neighborhoods, not because of any idea of solidarity, but because of factors like housing affordability. This trajectory has been the same in other ethnic neighborhoods like Little Havana, which is majority Cuban. But unlike Little Havana, the population that was there didn't move away. So since the neighborhood didn't experience the flight of their original inhabitants, the changes that occur in the neighborhood become fuel for the ethnic tensions between the new arrivals and the still present African Americans. I'm gonna skip some of that. African American communities do not experience financial, I can't think of the word that means goodness. They lack the capital, and so they are forced to work for white businesses. And then in turn, that means the businesses in the Black communities that can't afford to pay as high wages, close, and make the Black communities generally unhappy. And I'll talk more about what I mean about that later. In addition to the immigration, there's also Haitians still believe in the American dream while American Blacks don't. That's a quote from a Haitian doctor in the 1980s. Some of the tensions between them have to do with economic prosperity and the willingness to work in less than good conditions in order to move up in the social ladder. I will get into ethnographic methodology. I realize I didn't transition well. So during early adolescence, young people begin sort of earnestly exploring who they are as individuals. They develop a sense of who they are as defined by the groups they belong to. And this has been a focus of social research since the 70s. It's become also a useful framework for understanding behavioral and linguistic variation. Those individual identities are not created in a vacuum. The adolescents co-create a system of meaning and identities along with their peers. These structures often reflect socio-cultural structures, values, and ideologies of the community, but can be represented by symbols and signs that are not relevant to the community at large, like particular sociolinguistic variants. There's been a plethora of research on this throughout linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics. Primarily, the ethnographic work has been done in high schools as opposed to middle schools. And in addition, they do not concentrate on Black communities in the way that mine does. So this study is being completed at a South Florida middle school that I'm calling Michael Irvine Middle School. It's there, the Black Star. It's a public middle school that services 3 neighborhoods. The first is called The Gateway, which is again a pseudonym, which is here in the middle. And then you have Maison J in the green and Dessalines in the blue. MIMS is of particular interest given the differences in racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic makeups of the communities, and as well the ethno-racial experiences and interactions that the students at MIMS will have had throughout their young lives. So, sorry. In the last census, the Gateway was 50% Black and about 30% Hispanic and 20% white. This is in comparison to Dessalines, which is the blue area, which was 65% Black, 15% Hispanic, and 5% white. Maison J, on the other end of the Gateway, was 40% white, 40% Hispanic, and around 12% Black of any ethnicity. This is not reflected in the populations at the schools. The prevalence of private and charter schools in the region means that white and middle-class families with the means to send their children to other schools do so. Maison J, well, skip that. MIMS has about 600 students, 74% of which are Black, which is higher than the percentage of Black in any of the neighborhoods that feed into it. It's about 20% Hispanic and only 1% white, 5% mixed race or of some other ethnicity. When I was there, there was one student who was Anglo-white, meaning white of non-Hispanic origin. And I'm pretty sure she left the school before the end of the year. So hegemony is one of the ways in which dominant culture maintains their dominant position. And it's exercised through ideologies, attitudes, and values that are particularly perpetuated through education. That's important because my research site is a school. My school differs from many schools in past research in that the teachers themselves are representative of the students in the school. Most of the teachers speak African-American language or are fluent in Spanish. Many of them are direct immigrants from Haiti. And so their ideologies surrounding language and what it means to be correct do not necessarily match up to a school that's primarily Black in student population, but primarily white in teacher population. So in the example we see here, this teacher who is African American was attempting to elicit a definition of the word immigrated, which is based on a story that they read. They were talking about verbal morphology and the ED ending earlier in the class. So the teacher says, "What does immigrated mean in this sentence?" The student raises her hand and she says, "It means he'd been immigrated." Teacher says, "Okay, right, but what does that mean?" The student responds with, she sort of rolls her eyes, and then she says, "He'd been immigrated." Like this, she does a hand motion, sort of like, "He'd been immigrated for a long time." And the teacher again pauses. She says, "Okay, but can you define immigrated without using the word immigrated?" In this instance, the teacher didn't misunderstand the student's use of been, which is it's a marker of African American language that marks far past aspect. The student assumed that the thing she did wrong was use a non-standard form, but the teacher in this instance and the teachers throughout the school, I've never seen one of them correct an African American language feature. They're almost always trying to just correct the core issue, which in this case is using the word itself to define the word. Despite the fact that most of the faculty are Black, all of the support staff are Black, and the faculty and other adults in the school use African American language forms often, the students themselves still refer to their speech as slang or ghetto, which I sort of have yet to disentangle, but we can talk about that in the discussion. So for the data collection itself, I attended school from August in 2019 school year on a daily basis. I sat in the core classes with the students, went to the electives, and I went to lunch. Sort of hung out in their free time, which they don't really have much of. So some scholars prefer not to be associated with the faculty, and as such, they avoid being in classrooms. But in my case, I had little choice, not only because my participants are sixth graders, I obviously an adult to them, but they also only have 5 minutes between classes. And on a large open air campus, that means there's no time for open socialization like you might get in other schools. So finally, the kids at the school, I already described their demographics, but one thing I didn't describe is their range in terms of ages and academics and that sort of thing. The school itself is a magnet school, which attempts to attract high academic achieving students because of the technology magnet. That's generally unsuccessful, but they were trying to also start a medical magnet and a couple other programs there. The students that are there are all students from the neighborhood. In sixth grade, the students' ages range from typical sixth grader, which is about age 11, to age 15, because Florida allows them to hold back students pretty often. In addition, the school itself is about 2/3 male, presumably because the parents of the female students prefer to pull them out and put them in. separate public schools or separate charter schools. So let's get into a linguistic description. I'm going to quickly move through this description of African American language. It's an umbrella term used for the language varieties spoken by African Americans, particularly in the US and abroad. This is sort of a continuum that ranges from the most non-standard varieties to the most standardized or mainstream varieties. It's often spoken within primarily African American communities and within the homes of African Americans. African American youths typically learn the variety as their first language when growing up in these contexts. And in addition, immigrants who move into these communities often learn African American language as their first variety of English when they don't learn it in a classroom. In this talk, I concentrate on these three features: third singular s, plural-s, and the present tense copula, all of which have variable marking in African American language. I'm not going to go into my factors and the values because I don't have time, but if you have questions about those, we can talk about them later. The variable marking of third singular s is exactly what it sounds like. Mainstream American English uses she thinks she's all that with an s on the end, whereas African American language can say she thinks she all that without an s, or it could use an s. It depends on plenty of context. Plural-s, again, it's nearly absent in most vernacular varieties of African American language. So mainstream would say, I wish I had $1 million, whereas African American language would say, I wish I had $1 million. This is also important as a feature of English as it's learned by speakers of other languages. It's particularly languages like Haitian Creole that don't have the same sort of morphological marking. Finally, I discuss present tense copula. So in this example, I can just say she's all that with or she is all that with a copula, or in African American language, I can say she all that, something like that. There's a couple other things that go on with this, but again, we can talk about those at some other point if you want to. So let's move into the results of the linguistic description of these features. To be consistent with Rickford and King, I present the results in terms of absence rather than presence of the variant. So a speaker with 10 phrases of variable copula use, and let's say they have 10 with copula and 0 without copula, they would have 0% copula absence. So in the end, I had about 1,800 usable tokens from 29 participants. In this presentation, I'm only talking about the data from one-on-one interviews. So that's an interview with me and a kid. We had other interviews that were me and a group of kids, or a group of kids sitting in a room with a recorder just talking to themselves. But this is, I'm trying to simplify it by just focusing on one of the situations. In addition, most of these interviews are from March, which matters. So here are the results for third singular s. I realize it's a little bit difficult to read, maybe. And also, I didn't quite label the axes. So this goes from 0% absence to 100% absence. And then the numbers up the side are the participant numbers. This here is a figure that I copied from Rickford and King 2016 that compares the speech of individuals and groups of individuals from other studies and other locations. So as you can see, I have quite a large range of individual use of third singular s. I see. So so none of that's important right now. Skip. Plural-s had about 500 usable tokens, and the rate of absence for the community as a whole was 7%. I don't think I didn't write down the percent of the community as a whole on this slide, though I have it somewhere if you want to ask me later. It is significantly lower than the percentage of the communities in any of the past studies. You can see here that the percentage as a whole being 7% is aligned with the lowest percentages in past studies, but the range is kind of vast. So it ranges from 0% to 43%. And that will become important soon. So the Copula analysis yielded 1,000 usable tokens. And additionally, there was 14% Copula absence when using all tokens as a whole. We can talk more about my methods for that later. I just realized this is a really long presentation. Most of these participants ranged from 0% Copula absence to 72%. However, most of them are still below the threshold of what you would expect from African American language speakers in other communities. So part of the reason for this could be that this is an educational setting. And it could be that they're talking to me. So while I do switch to a less academic variety of English when I'm talking to them, I'm still a PhD student who primarily talks to other PhD students. And so my speech comes across as entirely more standard than just about anybody in the school. And so perhaps they accommodate towards my speech. But we can talk more about that later. So there is an correlation across the variables. And I'm not sure if you can see from here what each variable is. In this column is their percentage of absence for third singular s. The second column is their percentage of absence for copula, and the final column is the percentage of absence for plural-s. And they are colored from light to dark based on their percentage of third singular s. And as you can see, most of the ones who are very light stay towards the top, and most of them that are very dark stay towards the bottom. But it's not that simple, which we'll get to when we talk about the sociolinguistic variation. So probably some of the more interesting findings of this research include the social structure of the school. The students are sort of binarily split. So the population of the school at whole, binary splits between Black and Hispanic. Within the Black group, because most of the participants are Black, which is what I'm basing this off of, that splits between US socialized and non-US socialized, which I'll describe later. And then from there, it breaks off into particular social identities, interests, things like that. So talking about the first split, we can sort of compare this split to the typical white-Black dichotomy that is thought of as the racial structure of the United States. Some argue that this is not a white-Black, but a Black versus non-Black split. Here in my school, it is definitely comparable in that Black belongs to one group and Hispanic belongs to another. But it's also not comparable because neither the Hispanics or the Blacks really consider Hispanic to also include white people. There's no white people in the school, so it doesn't really factor into the social structure of the school. But some of the stuff that they say about race and ethnicity points to the fact that this split is most important to them, but if there was a white population, it would be a separate one. So not the binary split that we see often in US communities, but a three-way split. And I'm not sure where in there other ethnicities or other races would fit just because there's so few in the region. Here's an example of sort of linguistic commentary from a student about the Black-Hispanic split. So this is a female Hispanic sixth grader. So I ask, how do the kids talk at this school? She says, weird. It's like different because, I don't know, because some kids speak weird. And she did sort of not say kids with a plural-s there. She had enough of a pause that I could see the non-standardness there, but that's not important. I say next, so what kind of things do they say that's weird? And she says, okay, there's one, us Hispanics. There's another one that speak, I'm sorry, but they speak like ghetto, something like that. Later on, I ask, so do the Hispanics here speak normal or do they speak ghetto too? And she says, no, not ghetto, normal or Spanish. The next important split is between the US socialized and non-US socialized. I came up with this because it's not based on ethnicity like the adults in the community. So the split between adults in the community within phenotypically Black individuals in the community was between African Americans and Haitians, regardless of whether it's Haitians from Haiti or Haitians who grew up in the US. This school makes a distinction not between ethnicity itself, but where you were socialized. Not even where you were born, but I'd say socialized. So an example is I was sitting with a Hispanic American student in a classroom, and she really wanted to come with me so she could play Uno, which is something that we do sometimes in the interviews. And I said, they have Uno cards over there. Why don't you go play with them? And she said, those are the Haitians, separating them as a separate group. Even though she's Haitian American, her parents are of Haitian descent, all of those things. So it's not so much in attention to the Haitian name or the Haitian dress like the adults had. It's more particular language aspects and behavioral aspects. The final important split here, which I'm not going to get into exactly how it compares to past research, is the split that you most often think of in schools with adolescents is the split between sort of social interests. The three most common are the ones that sometimes, I realize in this presentation, sometimes I call them gamers and sometimes I call them popular. That's because I haven't quite decided which term fits best. The different kids have similar groupings. They just use different words to describe them. The next one is the nerd group. Everyone calls them nerds. There's no confusion there. And then the final one is the gang group. That's gang or bad, depending on who you ask. And so this is sort of just social awareness of the different groups. This is a 11-year-old female student. She talked like a nerd. She says about some student who she just categorized in a nerd group. I said, okay, how do nerds talk? She said, they just talk about weird stuff like aliens and Pokemon cards. She goes on to talk about how the gamers like video games, but only cool ones like Madden, and the nerds like video games like nerdy ones. So moving on into sociolinguistic variation, for this particular feature, concentrating on the differences between the social interest groups, show the most interesting things. It's a weird way to put it. If I look at all of my data, which includes a lot more features, different features are important to the different splits. But with the features that I am talking about today, it's primarily relevant to the social interest groups of the US socialized Black students. So you can recall our chart earlier that showed the distribution of the correlation of the variables across the three variables. In this next slide, I am only including the students who are core members of one of the groups. Being a core member means that they classify themselves as part of that group, and almost everybody that I ask classifies them as part of that group, whether it's someone that they just name off the top of their head as belonging to that group, or somebody that when I ask, they say, oh, she goes in this group. You can see here the stratification that sort of is related to the results of past sociolinguistic studies. You have primarily the nerds here as the most standard. That's the least percent absent. And then you have the cool kids that are sort of the least standard. I expected that the kids that are bad or gang would be the least standard because they care the least about what I think about them. And my speech being more standard, I would think they wouldn't even bother coming towards me. And what I think ended up happening is that the bad kids don't really care, but they don't really care either way. They're not really trying to prove to me how smart and nerdy they are. And they're also not trying to prove to me how cool they are. The cool kids, being early middle schoolers, try really hard to show you that they're cool. Everyone at the school has uniforms, but the things they talk about, the way they interact with not only their peers, but the teachers in the school, puts off the vibe that these are the popular kids in school. And this isn't the same as like the jocks from Eckert's work, because it's not really oriented towards the school versus oriented elsewhere. It's just wanting to feel like everybody likes you. You can see, maybe you can see, depending on how big your screen is, that at the bottom, there is one cool kid who is almost entirely standard. I will say, and I should have said it before, that there's multiple blue lines overlapping here at the bottom. It's just the way the thing looks. You can't tell that there's more than one down there. But there is one green that you can see only because he has one token that's different on the copula. And he's a pretty interesting case, which I'm not gonna look at in this talk or in my dissertation because I have too much data, but he would be an interesting person to look at in future studies. And if you want to know why, you can ask me later. So something I did was percentage comparisons of example students. I'm going to just quickly go through them to say that overall, the cool girl, who is the gold color one, she has the percentages that are most like the African Americans from other studies, though she does differ pretty significantly on some of them. And if you want to know specifics, you can again ask me in the questions. One thing that I am not getting into in this talk is the change over time as the kids start to develop their identities. But I have a little bit of an example on the next slide to show you sort of what I mean. These two participants are approximately the same age. At the beginning of school year, they were very good friends with each other. And at the end of the school year, in the middle of the school year before COVID, they were friendly with each other, but not good friends anymore. And you can see that in each of the interviews, they both change significantly in opposite directions. And this is something that I see with all of the students that I have longitudinal data from. And I'm gonna need to tease through it a little bit more to show exactly what changes and why. I will note that at the beginning of the school year, the youngest sixth graders really felt like kids. The boys would say, "Ew, I don't want to sit by the girls," and things like that. And sometime in the middle of the school year, the girls especially started, not playing outside. I mean, it's hot in Miami. You can imagine sprinting around outside in PE will get you kind of sweaty. So instead of playing, they would, ask to go sit in the library so they can sit and talk, or find somewhere sort of shady to do TikTok videos. So I don't remember where I was going with that, but it's cool nonetheless. So finally, as I am way beyond the time that I thought this was going to take me, is my discussion of how this study relates to past studies. Not just past sociolinguistic studies, but how it relates to the ethno-racial structure of Miami. So one thing, if you remember from the slide that looks like this one, if I can find it, the students at this school were not the same as the adults in their community. And I think this is because of changes in ideologies, particularly towards Haitians in the United States. The adults in the older generations, they grew up in a time where even popular media had negative Haitian ideologies in it. I don't know if you remember a few years ago when Trump said something like Haiti was a shithole country. I guess I'm a grown up, I can say that word. That's something that's sort of like a continuation of the general idea of Haiti from the 80s and the 90s. There was a lot surrounding the poverty there. You only ever hear of Haiti about being poor. And there's a lot there with the spread of HIV and AIDS, which are not talked about as much. And so unlike Eckert's study, where her groups sort of reflected groups that are sort of established in the community at large, these kids are changing how the society structure looks. And I don't know if it's them in particular, or if I missed out on a generation between people my age and people 20 years younger than me. But I think that's going to be interesting to follow, not just as these kids get older, but as Miami continues to develop, and change as it will, being a place. The next, sorry, I have too many slides. The next important fact for discussion is related to the status of African American language in the school setting. So one thing that I didn't talk about was the idea of standard as it's defined in this community. So everybody has an idea of what is standard. For me, it looks totally different than it might look to somebody from Dublin. In this community, being a primarily Black community with students that interact primarily with other Black people, you can see, particularly in the phonology and in the prosody that I'm not looking at here, that they don't necessarily have anything against African American language. They use what I would call African American language, even when they're being as standard as possible. So that in itself shows that their idea of standard is perhaps more vernacular than my idea of standard. And so a direction for future study is to see what they think of as standard, and discuss how that relates to the language variation here. And I am all the way out of time. So if you have questions, you can ask me. I have 100 other things to say, but I will just move on and say thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening to me. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks so much, Nandi. The floor is open for questions, and you can raise your hand in Zoom, or also type your questions. I'm going to stop the recording.